everybody to the Decolonising Culture panel. Having grown up in this gallery as a child in the 80s, when my father was actually an attendant after retiring from Ford, it's always a pleasure to be part of a dialogue with the objects and balls of the Herbert. So my father lived a long life, but he's no longer with us. Still, I think, I imagine him smiling admirably and critically at the throne of Maharaj Ranjit Singh, I think. So the book, Decolonising Methodologies, some of you may know, was first published by Linda to Y. Smith in 1999, 18 years ago. By Z Books, and it offers counter practices for dealing with indigenous knowledge. She suggests ways in which established research practices can be disrupted for more ethical and what she considers to be justice-oriented approaches. And of course her own perspective was informed by Maori knowledge. Her parents were teachers. Her father was, in fact, an anthropologist who worked closely with museums. And decolonising methodologies was much read and used by global indigenous movements. However, in the academy, the book did not become widely used. And it was in 2012 that it was republished. But in its second life, the book has taken off in the academy, as the very word decolonising has become much more present. So it's interesting to think through, as our panel will do with us tonight, what work is the notion of decolonising doing in the present moment. And there are, of course, connections, but also vital differences between forms in which decolonising is being used in the past for anti-colonial struggles against rule, as well as the way in which the word is being harnessed today. And of course we are going to be careful that we don't collapse different contexts in which the word decolonising has been mobilised for change. There are diverse global pathways in South America, South Africa, Aboriginal concerns in Australia, or other concerns in Canada, and in European context it's quite different, the way in which the word decolonise is being used. But these different trajectories, each of them carry different struggles and meanings. And then in the UK, the decolonial project has taken hold, especially in knowledge-based systems such as the academy and museums like we're in today. Some of these elements of what is referred to as a decolonial has, we always recognise, being articulated, for instance, within anti-racist movements and post-colonial initiatives. Now, just as bodies carry memories of joy and pain, so do objects. Objects tell us of which body shaped and crafted them. Objects also tell us of ownership and dispossession. And the glorious golden velvet seat of Maharaj Ranjit Singh, a seat that invites us to take a seat, but of course we can't, not only bears histories of court society, but also histories of dispossession, including the political biography of his son, Maharaj Dalip Singh, who sat on it as a teenager. And indeed, the very movement of this seat bears the shift in power towards British rule, and the chair was taken to London in 1853 to the East India Company Museum, and from here it moved to the V&A. So of course material objects we know clearly bear histories, but they don't speak for themselves. Those histories don't speak for themselves. There are multiple ways in which we can label them. And in the current exhibition that the V&A has brought to the Herbert, it's chosen a framework which emphasises the craft of the objects, as well as the multi-faith backgrounds of the craftspeople. This is incredibly important. But we know that these labels clearly could be relabeled or layered with other information or different pathways which are currently not scribed on the labels. but certainly are inscribed in the objects. So looking at conditions of possession and how objects circulate and what we do in this decolonial moment, we have an amazing panel with us of speakers. And we're going to begin with, sorry, I've left my other sheet down here, with Radha Kapuria, and she's travelled from London to be with us. Radha is a Commonwealth scholar, nearly finishing, about to submit her PhD on music and colonial Punjab. And she's looked at the gendered aspect of Ranjit Singh's rule. And in fact, she's pioneering some very important original archival material to look at how dance, music, and gender work. So we'll hand over to Radha.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm going to speak about the empire of Ranjit Singh and the position of female performers at his court, and you know, with the aim of decolonizing narratives on them. And we'll see in a minute why it's important to decolonize narratives on female musicians and dancers, because it's very often they are viewed in this sort of Orientalist manner. So let's start. Maharaja Ranjit Singh was the last autonomous ruler of undivided Punjab, and he reigned over a fairly vast territory, which sort of, I don't know if it's visible, but the shaded bits in orange is the extent of his empire. It stretched from Peshawar to Kashmir and, you know, to Multan in the south. And you can see the sort of the rivers as a sort of thin vein in the background. So that's the land of the 5 rivers, which is the name, which is where Punjab, the etymology comes from. And it's divided, as we can see, between India and Pakistan today, and much of it lies in current-day Pakistan. And you know, his sort of power and control was, his power was threatening to the East India Company state. And there was, so Ranjit Singh was viewed with a lot of awe and fear and admiration by figures like William Bentinck, who was Governor General, you know, by British officials. And the focus on dancing girls shows us that this was the one area where he could be criticized without, you know, without any fear. And so he was actually, you know, that's the image from Osborne's book, and it shows you the typical image of dancing girls as associated with wine and sort of, you know, harbingers of evil and very insalubrious, right? So that sort of Orientalist gaze. And that sort of 2 quotes which I've put up, and there are innumerable sort of such references. Charles Metcalfe said that he was a prince unrestrained by principles of Christian rectitude or any courtesies of civilized life. And then they would say, oh, look at his dancing girls, right? And then even Jacques Mo, who was the French naturalist whom Ranjit Singh actually funded. You know, he funded his research, and we know how important it is as researchers to have funding. He as well said that, you know, one knows Orientals are debauched, but they have some shame about it. Ranjit's excesses, on the other hand, are shameless. Yeah? So this is the part of, you know, this is how you sort of look at a ruler and say, oh, this is a bad person. And I'm sure we can discuss this in better ways, and I apologize for my crippled theoretical approach, but as a historian, I'm just going to show you some evidence. However, I think it came from a sense of unfamiliarity with Indian music. And Indian music was very bewildering to Europeans who visited the subcontinent during this period. And so the idea of dancing girls is very interesting, because they were not just dancing girls, they also sang. And they were musicians and dancers. But here we have a quote from Osborne, which says that these were new set of dancing girls, as they were called, though they turned out to be 12 of the ugliest old women I ever saw, and who were highly indignant at being sent away on account of their looks, without being permitted to display their talents in screaming. So singing is screaming, and this is why the nautch or the dance performance becomes central for Ranjit Singh to broadcast his power to Europeans and to the British. Music doesn't seem to sort of achieve that. That's an image of Behram Khan, who is the founder of a very prominent lineage of Dhrupad music in South Asia today, and he was employed by Ranjit Singh. So Ranjit Singh gave patronage to classical music and dance, and in an attempt to decolonize female performers, I am arguing that they were actually a very prominent part of arts patronage at Ranjit Singh's court. And this is like a very prominent musician who was employed at Lahore. That's another image of musicians at the Sikh court. So instead, I think we need to revise our view of Ranjit as a patron of the arts and a connoisseur of music and dance. And there are innumerable references to him listening to the flute and sort of employing these musicians of a high caliber. And the female performers are part of that. This is a music treatise which was written during Ranjit's reign. It's in Gurmukhi characters but in Braj Bhasha. And it's in the British Library. And it's a detailed account of the different rags or the different musical modes. But in it you have the sort of praise for Lahore. And he says that the glory of the Punjab is the city named Lahore. And Naam Lahore na aur lage, Mani desan ki mahi ke madhi so hai. The name of Lahore is such that no other place appears so. It is the gem of the country, the brilliance of the world. And the author, Diwan Lachiram, actually moves to Lahore to avail of the stability and peace which is established once Ranjit Singh, takes over and with his reign. So it's very much a part of that milieu where the arts are being sort of encouraged. And the view of courtesans, the internal view by Ranjit and his courtiers, is very different from what the European or sort of this kind of British idea of it being debauched, right? Or the East India Company, I should perhaps say. And so they were the courtesans, the dancing girls, were always performing at the end of a political negotiation. And if we just look at the last sentence there, it says, after they sang, the dust of ill will and tiresomeness and the rust of worry and anxiety got erased from the hearts of the world with the eraser of excessive music. So this sort of soothing impact of music, and it's actually a part of the political ritual which Ranjit Singh assembles in Lahore. I have that image of Amazons in Greek myth because towards the end of his reign, in the last 10 years, he died in 1839, and somewhere around 1830 he assembled a band of female performers whom all the European accounts refer to as Amazons, as Ranjit's Amazons, because these were dancers who would be dressed as soldiers, as cross-dressing dancers with bows, arrows, swords, and sort of in mimic combat, so performing sort of the battlefield, inside the court. And it's I think Again, these are also ubiquitous, and they sort of are referred to by a lot of visitors to the port. And he says, for example, when he was showcasing them to William Bentinck at one of the major spectacles at Ropar in present-day Haryana, Maharaja said, pointing out to them, that there stood the Subedar, or the captain, and the Jamadar, and the Chowkidar. These are terms in the army. So this is what a rank in the army would sound like. So of course it's not, they're not actually fighting on the battlefield, but there's a sort of cultural, sort of soft power which, and it was called the Zenana platoon. Zenana is the word for the female quarters. And you know, so the sort of Bentinck would grant them money in return. We have a reference to the Amazons, also a very interesting reference from Sir Alexander Burns, who's called Bokhara Burns as well, because he was a spy in the great game of the East India Company, you know, in Afghanistan. So, very interesting figure. He also told us that when we arrived, we found Ranjit seated on a chair with a party of 30 or 40 dancing girls who were dressed in boys' clothes. And their Don Giovanni costume was improved by a small bow and quiver in each hand. And this, said Ranjit Singh, is one of my regiments of Paltans, but they tell me it is one I cannot discipline. So again, this sort of captures the fact that they had the power to subvert the authority of Ranjit as well. So in that sense, subverting the norms which Ranjit had put in place, and he was a fairly authoritarian ruler as well, which is not to say that he was repressive, but he, you know, he showed who was boss. But in fact, this was one of the regiments which actually subverted that. To come to a close, this is one of the few European travelers who gives us an unbiased and objective account instead of just saying, oh, this is a debauched Oriental prince and these are all his vices. He gives us a fairly detailed description of the fact that in Lahore, the courtesans are valued and better paid for than in other places. So it's actually evidence to show that they were well looked after as a class. And in fact, they had land grants and, you know, well endowed with wells. So they were actually respected as professionals. And he goes on to say that it's not similar to Calcutta, where they're often children, stolen children or slaves. But in Lahore, they're daughters and relatives of dancers. And their education requires an apprenticeship of 9 years. So this sort of gives us a closer, better picture of how courtesans were, you know, the material conditions at Lahore. And finally, Maharaja Ranjit Singh married 2 Muslim courtesan women, and he fell in love with them, as opposed to his other sort of 20 wives who were political wives. And you know, gender in Ranjit Singh's court is a whole new other realm, which my friend Dr. Priya Atwal speaks very well about. And but Bibi Mora was the first woman he married for love, and she was a Muslim courtesan from Amritsar. And before they got married, she used to go to Lahore to perform, to, you know, dance for him. And once when she was going, her silver slipper, this is the story, fell into the river that went into the canal that took water to Lahore, to the Shalimar Gardens. And she was very upset, and she said, I refuse to come and, you know, lose all my possessions in this sort of canal unless you build me a bridge which is safe. So he built her Tawaif Pul, or it's also known as Pul Kanjri in popular references today, or the Bridge of the Courtesan. And this today is located on the Wagah border, like not exactly on the border, but it's almost there. It's like a stone's throw away. And it's very interesting because this was captured in '65 by the Pakistan Army and then reclaimed by the Indian Army in 1971. And it's sort of a very interesting symbol of the bridge between, also between India and Pakistan, and how music has continued to unite people on both sides of the border. And I think Pull Country is a good material symbol of that. Thank you.
That was a fascinating opening to our panel, and I'm sure we have lots of questions and want to hear more from you actually in the discussion. And our second speaker is Sariya Cheruvallil-Contractor. She's a research fellow at Coventry University, so a local like me, in faith and peaceful relations. Her research focuses on the lived experiences of religion and belief in modern Britain, with particular emphasis on Islam, feminism, interfaith relations, and probably most importantly for our panel today, democratic methodologies.
Thank you, Chair, for striding with my name and getting it right. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tan and the Herbert, for organizing this event, and thank you, fellow panelists. Tan's brief to me was to discuss, before I begin, you will have to forgive me for my very croaky voice. I hope it lasts. Tan's brief to me was to reflect on what decolonizing culture actually means. And so I thought about it, and I thought long and hard. To me, the entire decolonizing movement is precluded on this disruption of the current politics and hierarchies of knowledge. To me, also, knowledge and culture are intrinsically and inherently interconnected. Knowledge shapes the stories that we tell each other about human achievement, about ourselves. And these stories, when regarded collectively, constitute our history, constitute our identity, and bring together, determine the values, the cultures, the practices, the beliefs that we describe as our culture. And so, in order to decolonize culture, we need to first ask ourselves some questions. Who tells stories and for whom? Who produces knowledge and who gives them the authority to do so? Who disseminates this knowledge? Who shares this knowledge? And again, with whom? And really then, to decolonize culture is to address the deep inequalities that we find when we try to answer these questions. So there you go. As an academic, I've done my bit. I've theorized randomly in the air, but now let me make it real. I really should, otherwise, she might ban me. In terms, then, let me start with the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, and she writes about the danger. She warns us all about the danger of the single story that is told by those who are in power with a view to sustaining their privilege and their authority. There are problems with the single story, she tells us. The problems are, and the biggest problem indeed, is that it is incomplete. It is not inclusive, and it does not include the voices of those who live at the margins, of those who are less privileged. Now, this entire discussion about hierarchies of knowledge and about the dangers of the single story became very apparent to me when I was researching for my first book that was called Muslim Women in Britain, Demystifying the Muslimah. Very quickly, as I looked through the literature and I looked through what was written historically, I became aware that usually it was people who were not Muslim, or people who were not women, or people who were neither Muslim nor women, who were speaking for Muslim women. So, some Muslim men told us about this precious and delicate Muslim woman who had to be protected at all costs from the evil corruption of the West, full stop. And then we had the Orientalist thinker, that you alluded to as well, talking about these beautiful birds in their gilded cages, sexually so attractive but very difficult to attain. And then we had some feminist thinkers screaming from rooftops about how we had to rescue this poor Muslim woman, or this poor South Asian woman, or this poor Hindu woman, you can fill that blank, from her backward culture, from her backward faith, from her backward systems. Okay, so that's what I read about potentially me. And so I went into diverse British communities, British Muslim communities, to speak to these poor little women who had to be either rescued or protected. And I didn't find very many. I did find problems. I found problems, domestic abuse, all sorts of things. But I also found overwhelmingly strong women, women who were role models for their children, women who were leading and shaping their communities, women who were full-time moms, women who had diverse careers ranging from doctors and nurses and teachers to forensic scientists. I didn't quite understand what she did. Comedians, maybe that's another job for me in the future. But these were women who did not want to be rescued. These were women who did not want to be protected. But these were women who wanted to be recognized. That was what they all wanted, and that is what my book became about. It was a reinstating of Muslim women as storytellers who could tell their own stories, who could claim their own knowledge. And it became immensely empowering for us all. For the women, they told their stories. For me, I took pleasure in facilitating this storytelling. And for everybody who listened to those stories, well, they came away with a better understanding of what it means to be a Muslim woman, and a better understanding of what it means to live in a diverse, globalized world. Now let me tell you another story. This is about one of my former students. She's now a teacher and a counselor, and the school that she teaches at is overwhelmingly Muslim and an all-female. Now every year I get invited to go to the school to do a talk, whatever talk, and it becomes a big hoo-ha, celebration, everybody gets cake, everybody is really pleased. I'm not quite sure whether it's about my talk, but it's probably the cake. But I asked my student, why do you do this? Why do you invite me year on year? And she says it's because these young women, I need them to know that somebody who's a woman, somebody who looks like them, or probably at least their older sister, not their mother, somebody who looks like them, somebody who believes like them, who feels like them, somebody who comes from a background just like theirs. She wants them to know that somebody like them can be an intellectual leader. Now I am humbled by that deeply. I don't think I'm anywhere there yet. However, I am also deeply troubled by this. I'm deeply troubled by the fact that our curricula, as taught in schools, colleges and universities, by our culture, as demonstrated in the telly we watch, in the movies, in the news, in the books we read, I'm concerned that both our culture and our curricula is still riddled with blind spots and lacunae regarding the contributions to history of people who are somehow lesser privileged, of people who are somehow, who somehow inhabit the margins. To demonstrate this, let's talk about Western philosophy briefly. And often when I do that, I'm told about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and how their thoughts have swooshed through Western civilization to shape our values today around freedom of expression and speech, around democracy, and so on and so forth. That's one story, perhaps an incomplete one. Let me tell you another. It's now well known that when the West was in the Dark Ages, other parts of the world, in India, like Radha told us, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, there were societies and people and cultures that were at the height of artistic and intellectual production. We also know now for a fact that the learnings, historians tell us, that the philosophy of the Greeks and the Romans would have been lost forever in the Dark Ages if it was not for the Arab Muslim philosophers of North Africa who took the Greek and the Roman, translated it to Arabic, studied it, made it their own, developed it, and then passed it on to the likes of Thomas Carlyle and his colleagues at the end of the Dark Ages. Indeed, some historians tell us there are possibilities that the Renaissance would not have happened if it wasn't for these Arab Muslim philosophers. People like Ibn Rushd, whom we know as Averroes, and Ibn Sina, whom we know as Avicenna. What is unfortunate to me is not only have we forgotten the contributions that these men made, we've also erased their names from history. We've translated them to incorporate them into this monoculture. And I think we all have a responsibility to future generations, to young people, to ourselves, to tell them the stories that they deserve to know, to tell them the stories that reflect the diversity of our world. Because if we don't tell them stories, we will constrain their learning and suppress their aspiration. Because stories don't, as human beings, we don't just make stories, stories make us too. To conclude then, I've told you what I think the decolonizing movement is. It is about stories that are inclusive and representative. But these are also stories about interconnectedness. And what I don't want the decolonizing culture movement to become is one of, particularists, where we all sit in our little corners in our safety zones and talk about, stories that are our own. So the black tells this story and the Muslim tells her story. And we sort of go on in our own little individual cubicles, separate from each other forever. Instead, we need to tell stories of our interconnectedness. How European philosophers learned from the Arabs, and the Arabs in turn learned from the Europeans who preceded them. That interconnectedness is what we need. The decolonizing culture movement should also not become one where we privilege the voices that are currently in power. We need to tell stories that belong to everybody, and we need to at least try to strive for utopian egalitarianism. I don't believe it's possible, but we can try. And finally, there's this little warning that I have about nomenclature. Colonialism, the Raj as we know it, has gone. It's history. However, new monocultures, as Tim Winter describes them, under the guise of, consumer capitalism, what have you, are sweeping the world. So every time I go back to India, I'm shocked by how, the fewer saris and the fewer salwar kameezes that I see. This is India's power, the artisan soft culture, but somehow it's becoming less valuable, less fashionable. To conclude then, I think our culture encompasses a lot. It encompasses our history, our beliefs, our values, our fashion, our artisans and the art that they produce. It also encompasses our stories. And I'll conclude with the same thought that I articulated a few minutes ago. We really have to be careful about the stories that we tell, because we don't just make stories as human beings, but the stories make us too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sariya, for underlining the interconnected nature of stories and to be alert to the drive towards modern culture development. Our next speaker is Priya Ganchandani. She's a curator and writer, and she's worked as the head of art programs for India at the British Council in New Delhi, and also at the V&A Museum as the lead for a design fund for contemporary acquisitions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just checking what this is on. Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I'm so pleased, and thanks to Pam, that we heard that it's having such a progressive discussion about the arts and decolonisation. I'm from a museum background, and I wanted to address this issue in the context of museums. I grew up in a town actually not very different from Coventry, just north of London. But we weren't lucky enough to have as amazing a museum as this. So on the weekends I generally went to London, and I went to places like British Museum, the Royal Academy. I remember growing up being really excited when Tate Modern opened, and I saw Anish Kapoor exhibit there for the first time. I remember going to the National Gallery and seeing a Rousseau painting for the first time, and I remember this one of a tiger going through a jungle, and that I had a print of it in my room when I was very young. So I was exposed to so much through these institutions. And when I finished university later, I later did a postgrad at the Royal College of Art. I was lucky enough to work with some of these institutions. And I, in fact, continue to find them as inspiring. In fact, they started opening up their public programs more and more, and they introduced things like Friday Lates, which made them really fun. In fact, in many ways, I think our museums have never been better. But I'm here because there's still a fundamental problem, which relates to the subject that we're discussing this evening, which is that museums still aren't dealing with significant parts of our history, particularly Britain's colonial past. And since we're here to see the Crafts of Punjab exhibition, I thought I'd talk about this in the context of India. See if I can get the slide to work. Okay. Now this year marks the 70th anniversary of India's independence from more than 200 years of British rule. So I thought, what better a time for our museums and galleries to square up to Britain's colonial legacy, especially since there's some people that think that empire was a good thing. This chart shows the results of a poll which found that the British public are proud of colonialism and the British Empire. In fact, 44% of people responded to a YouGov survey saying they were proud of Britain's colonial history, and only 21% regretted that colonialism had ever happened. The rest didn't have a view on it. Now, I thought I'd address this in response by telling you some examples of why colonialism definitely was not a good thing for South Asia. Sorry if some of these are obvious to certain of you, but clearly they're not to everyone. Now, partition. When Britain left India in 1947, it divided India into 3 countries, India, Pakistan, and eventually Bangladesh. This led to one of the biggest migrations in history. 15 million people were displaced in all, and in the process, something that I myself didn't know when I was growing up, more than 1 million people died. The Bengal famine. British policies in India were largely to blame for this. It happened in 1943, and it was so bad that it's been likened to a genocide. 3 million Indian people starved to death, and it was partly because Britain had exported huge amounts of food from India for its own consumption. The Amritsar massacre. In April 1919, thousands of peaceful protesters demonstrated against colonial rule in the city of Amritsar. They ended up being blocked into a wall area where troops led by General Dyer opened fire on them and indiscriminately killed them. He was later lauded as a hero by Britain. Unfortunately, these are some of the atrocities of empire that our education system and our museums and galleries just don't talk about much. In fact, most of us who went to school in this country were never even taught about them. That's because the British Empire is not a core part of the national curriculum. It's no wonder that an Indian intellectual called Shaheen Tharoor recently said that Britain has a historic amnesia regarding empire. There have been lots of exhibitions about empire in our museums, don't get me wrong. But even the most well-meaning and wonderful museums which have inspired many of us don't really broach the negative aspects very often. Now, one of my favourite museums is the V&A. It's a place where I studied and I went on to work. And I think it has some of the most amazing exhibitions in the world, from David Bowie to Alexander McQueen. But even museums like the V&A have struggled to do justice to what actually happened. One empire-related exhibition at the V&A earlier this year was about John Locke with Kipling. He was a British art teacher, an artist and a curator. He was also the father of Rudyard Kipling, the poet. And he spent most of his career in British India. Now, it's fair to say Kipling did understand and appreciate Indian visual culture, but that doesn't mean he was free of the politics of empire. And I think the exhibition about him is one of the many examples of the story of empire being told with the focus on the role of the colonizer, a white man in this instance, without really saying anything about the dark side of empire, or the people who were being colonized. Another example is an exhibition on at the moment, and it's called Splendours of the Subcontinent, and it's about Prince of Wales' 4-month tour of India in 1875, and it does show some of the most amazing Indian treasures from the royal collection. Among the objects that he collected was this really stunning inkstand, which is in the form of a barge, which is jewel encrusted and has this enamelled peacock inlaid with sapphires and diamonds at one end. It's a pretty incredible object. And there's no doubt objects like this are worth appreciating. But once again, it's an example of a colonial history focusing on the role of the British coloniser. And the jewels are wonderful, but what about all the atrocities that I talked about? How often do they get addressed? Now, as I said, that's not to say our museums are not well-meaning. They are. But even well-meaning museums are wrapped up in the politics of empire, and that's because of some of the reasons I'm going to go through. Now, many of the museums that we respect most, which have collections from colonial countries, they were basically set up during empire, like the British Museum, V&A, and the Natural History Museum. And the point of their collections was to form a physical archive that gave order to different cultures. A bit like this watercolour from an East India Company album of 1930. It shows 3 couples, each from a different caste, and they're distinguished only by what they're wearing. Also, placing things in museums helped enforce London as a centre of empire and a place through which British people could experience colonies without leaving their own shores. In this way, the British kind of constructed a Victorian fantasy of Oriental or Eastern people. Now, that fantasy wasn't always negative. At least it wasn't overtly negative. In fact, collecting and displaying objects from throughout the British Empire was a way of admiring them. They were put on show at events like the Great Exhibition of 1851, which you can see here in a print, where India had a particular prominence, as you can see, with the rather elaborate elephant and lots of other objects. But the point is that doing this divided the colonisers from the people being colonised. For example, India's manufacturers were praised at this event for being beautiful, but displays of India's machinery were seen as being crude and primitive compared to Victorian technology. The British, you see, didn't see industrial development as being a good thing for India. Instead, the Indian village was idealised and the handicrafts were seen as being quaint, when in reality, in hindsight, we can only really call this patronising. Although handicrafts and decorative art produced in India were appreciated, Indian art wasn't really cared for. A critic called George Birdwood, he wrote this book called The Industrial Arts of India. He blamed Hindu mythology for what he called the monstrous nature of Indian art. Some objects were even completely misunderstood through a colonial perspective. This bracelet is from the province of Sindh and was acquired by the V&A, and I researched it a few years ago. And the museum notes from the time described the ends as monsters or dragons. And George Birdwood, the critic I mentioned, heavily disapproved of the use of these sorts of figures. He said that monstrous shapes were unsuitable for higher forms of artistic representation. Well, actually, these sorts of creatures appear in Hindu mythology, and they definitely weren't considered to be monstrous. In this extract, George Birdwood blames the depiction of things like monsters for effectively ruining fine art in India. He advocates British art as being better because it doesn't have Hindu mythology and it represents humans instead. Exhibiting objects from India, which were the product of empire, turned them into an imperialist fantasy, by imposing a certain view of empire, Britain was able to assert authority over and shape perceptions of other cultures. Of course, many factual misunderstandings about objects like the ones I've mentioned have been corrected by museums over the years. But the legacy of defining the East as being culturally different has caused more long-lasting harm. Even well-meaning museums, where the spoils of empire are kept now, can't help but inherit those dynamics and the legacy of what we now refer to as Orientalism. And even though they're run by different people, they will have to work really hard to rewrite history using the same collections that were formed during colonial times. I wanted to look ahead to conclude and talk briefly about how we might consider trying to decolonise our museums. And there are a few key questions. Firstly, I think it's important to think about what version of history do our collections tell, and do they represent the full truth? For example, a textile that was made in the 18th century in the UK is not just a textile. In fact, the UK gave themselves a monopoly over textile weaving in India, and therefore any textile from that period is bound to carry the stamp of Victorian industrial consumption, the reshaping of ideas about India, and the oppressive force of colonialism. Secondly, why was that object collected in the first place, and for whose benefit? For example, the inkstand, or any object collected during this period, is not just an object, as it inevitably bears the imprint of empire. And most importantly, who is being given a voice? Is it the colonizer, like in the case of the Kipling exhibition, or the people being colonized? How often is it the latter, and how can people's perspectives be more empowered? I mean, the way in which culture is being talked about and empire is being talked about is starting to be challenged. I was going to talk a little bit about this, but our next speakers have been working on an exhibition at Birmingham Museums that is about challenging typical colonial narratives. And I'm sure you'll be really interested to hear about the work that they've been doing. We still need a museum or an exhibition of empire that deals with the atrocities head-on. That's one thing that very few people are talking about. It's the 70th anniversary of the independence of India, and there's a lot happening this year to mark that has been initiated at government level. But the flip side is it's also the 70th anniversary of partition, and that's something that we're much more silent about. Our museums might not hold collections relating to partition, but that doesn't mean it's okay for our history to be silent about it. I think it's worth thinking about why an official exhibition in the UK about the atrocities of empire is still so inconceivable. I wonder if it's because it's too difficult, too painful. Is it because we take a rosy view of our own history? And do national crimes play little or no part in that history? All in all, I really think we have some serious questions to ask, and that it's time we stopped telling stories that paint a rosy picture of our history and face up to its realities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sariya, for making us think about empire, but not in the way in which it's been idealised and the violence and dispossessions have been erased. So now we have two speakers together. We're especially lucky. Shaheen is a textile artist and pattern maker. She specialises in Islamic, South Asian, and North African art forms. She's a curator of the Past is Now exhibition at the Birmingham Museum Art Gallery, and programmer for Decolonise, Not Diversify festival that took place in Birmingham last year. And she's also the co-founder of the Art Against the Grain Collective. Together, Shaheen will speak with Sara Wajid, who's the head of interpretation at the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, so they're colleagues. And she leads a Story Lab project to reinterpret the collections for multicultural audiences. And she's also the founder of the Museum Detox Network for BME Museum staff. And in fact, in 2003, 13 years ago, I met Sara right here in this gallery, not this room, but the Herbert. And she'd come up from London, ventured out, as Londoners see it, from London, all the way from London to Coventry, with Sukhdev Sandhu, to see an exhibition on cinema and film, South Asian cinema going in Closewall, Coventry, and some members of the team who worked on that at the back of this room, Martin and Alison. So it's great to have you back again, Sara, and today with another member of your current team.
Thanks very much, everybody, for sticking to the end. Shaheen and I are doing a double act. So I'm going to speak for the first 3 or 4 minutes, and then we're going to
Switch over.
Yeah, I'm going to switch over a little bit. It's fairly informal. So we'll probably be about 12 minutes realistically, but we'll try and keep it sort of punchy. So yeah, as Noel said, I work at Birmingham Museum Art Gallery, and I've been working with Shaheen and a total of 5 co-curators, and there's sort of a team of 6 of us who are staff. In total, there's basically 12 of us effectively who've been working as a team on an exhibition which you're going to hear about a lot more in a minute. My background is kind of a museum background for the last 7 years or so. Before that I was a journalist. So everything that Priya said, Priya is also, that actually happens to be the chair of the steering committee of the Museum Detox Network. Everything that Priya said is like the perfect sort of setup basically for our exhibition. Everything that she said is basically why we're doing this type of exhibition. So a little bit there about Birmingham. That's basically, you know, you probably know this instinctively, but the YouGov poll that Priya talked about, I suspect if you did that poll in Birmingham, it's like an uncanny bit of soundtrack for it. If you did that YouGov poll in Birmingham, I suspect you'd get a very different answer than the national picture, which is pretty much why I came to Birmingham from the National Maritime Museum to do this project, because I felt like Birmingham is the place, the Birmingham Museum Art Gallery is the place in the country that is most ripe and most sort of ready and prepared to do a decolonial experiment effectively of how you look at Victorian collection. And they're right because they're about to do a massive redevelopment of the whole museum. It's one of the largest kind of collections, civic collections in the country, and the Victorian collection. And when you times that by the population of Birmingham, the museum director, Ellen McCallum, is extremely clear about the fact that the redevelopment of the museum has to put engaging and embedding multicultural audiences and multicultural audiences of the future in particular at the absolute heart of the redevelopment. So I thought, well, that sounds tasty, that's worth leaving London for. And actually they probably are kind of quite serious about that because the numbers can't lie. So that seemed like the place, the most sort of fertile ground for thinking about decolonial practice. And by decolonial practice, I suppose, like, there's been a lot of projects about diversifying audiences in the museum sector in the last 20 years. In the 10 years that I've been closely involved in those, I'm really bored of talk about race and representation, because it really kind of, things tend to stay at a fairly shallow level in terms of the debate, in terms of, like, knowledge production. It's generally about brown bums on seats, if I can put it that way, and it doesn't really kind of, despite the best intentions, it often doesn't really go much further than talking about kind of how we're going to get people through the door, can we do community projects, can we change our marketing, can we kind of, what's wrong with it? Sometimes the conversation gets a bit deeper and says, why aren't there any black people on the board of governors, maybe that's got something to do with it. But actually, as time went on, I kind of realised I was in education and learning, but I kept looking at what the curators were doing and thinking that that's where the power is. And they kind of seem to be making all the decisions about the collections and what's going on the walls of the East India Company Gallery in the National Maritime Museum. And I kind of felt basically the knowledge production was so compromised, at a deeper level, that no matter what I was doing, chipping away around workforce diversity or militating around governance, actually, unless people kind of got to grips with the knowledge production issues, all of that brown bumps on seat stuff was just a kind of a distraction. It wasn't really kind of getting to the heart of the issues. And actually, if we kept on that path, then small, sort of discrete projects, maybe working with particular community groups representing their own kind of stories, we were never really going to kind of fundamentally dismantle these sort of flawed and compromised knowledge production processes. And I could see green shoots of interesting kind of practice happening here and there, but it wasn't really coming together, it wasn't really coalescing in anything that really that really felt like a departure. So then I started seeing these developments around co-curation. I thought, oh, here's some hope. Like, this is like giving up some of the power, like mixing things up. It's not quite that kind of old model of community curated like exhibitions. It's something slightly different. It's about like redeveloping, and then people start talking about organisational change, which is the latest like jargon in museum sort of management speak. And organisational change seems to be the polite way of saying we've kind of messed this all up and it's all like a bit rubbish, and we need to kind of get to the roots of why organisations are super serving a really narrow kind of well-educated audience. And organisational change is the new language about sort of everything has to be, the cultural DNA of the organisation has to be reconsidered. So co-curation is basically seemed like a model whereby staff curators were kind of talking about knowledge and hierarchies of knowledge being disrupted and maybe like opened up to sort of knowledge, different types of knowledge beyond the museum. So, to talk about Story Lab now, I've gone on a bit, that was quite a lot of preamble. Yeah, so I wanted to just, before I bring Shaheen in, talk about what co-curation models were around. And at the National Maritime Museum there was this one, which was sort of a prototyping lab, which was really about kind of testing ideas before you go ahead. Like a permanent gallery is often up for like 10, 15, sometimes if you're really unlucky 20 years, and they look really stale and boring. So if you prototype some of those ideas as you're going to see what audiences think when you put it out there. It seems really commonsensical and obvious, but for museum practitioners this is like crazy innovation, that you like might test an idea and like market test it before you actually spend like 20 million on it and put it out for 20 years. So this is how, you know, people started sensing that actually, okay, you're going to find out something new if you co-curate. I looked at a really massive co-curated gallery at the Science Museum called Information Age really closely, and I compared it to the Faith in Birmingham gallery here in Birmingham. And these are two different models of co-curation. And the Information Age gallery is basically really dry subject, the history of information communication technology. That is dry. It's really hard to make that sexy. The objects are like cables and like old mobile phones and like dead tellies and stuff like that. Nobody really wants to see an exhibition about that. Even the Science Museum knew that. So they tried to make it human, humanize it. And they worked with like loads of different groups, like the Samaritans, so that instead of just hearing about the like technology of telephones, you could hear about people sobbing down the telephone, and that's more interesting, and all of the kind of emotional resonance. And then they worked with a Cameroonian group to look at the information technology developments in Cameroon. And the Cameroonian group did an amazing job for 2 years working on this mobile phone display. But it was like as big as about 10 chairs by 10 chairs. And the gallery, total gallery, was probably the size of 10 times this room. And so when your average like non-white person went in the gallery, the only thing that they would see that represented black people was this particular Cameroonian case. And it was really brightly coloured and vivid and fantastic. But then when I did some consultation with people, including Priya, to ask like non-white kind of equivalents of the Radio 4 white typical traditional museum like visitor profile, Priya, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this, would say like, yeah, but like, why are all the white inventors and scientists stuff over here, and it's all like glistening and gleaming and really important, and it's sort of like shiny technology, and it's like thrusting and innovative, and the one non-Western piece of culture that I can see in this gallery is kind of a sort of like shabby mobile phone repair shop. And it was only if somebody who was in a position of power in terms of decision making had looked at that gallery through the lens of black experience that that is the thing that would have jumped out with them. So that 2 years of work that Cameroonian group did doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. So that's why when we came to Birmingham, I was really keen to work with activists, because I thought cultural activists are the people who can meet the museum at the point that the museum operates on in terms of knowledge and culture. It's a very sophisticated machine, the museum, in many ways. It's a sort of machine for making meaning. And you have to come at that really equipped. You have to really know how culture works. So we were really lucky to find people like Shaheen, and Shaheen found another 4 people. We approached Shaheen and Alia, and they are basically like published authors, you know, cultural activists who have succeeded in like closing down an exhibition at the Barbican, committed decolonisers who are also like themselves practitioners and graphic designers who know a lot about producing culture because they're culture makers. And so we started working with them and thinking about co-curation and decolonial knowledge production with them. And now I'm going to let Shaheen speak, get a word in edgeways.
Hello. Okay. So it's this. Yeah, everyone can hear me. Fine. Okay, great. So I'm just going to carry on from that. So myself and 5 other co-curators came together, asked by Sarah to come into the on this project and to help to somehow decolonise a very small part of a very large collection. And like Sarah said, we're all from different backgrounds in terms of heritage, but in terms of profession as well. So we're a real mixed bunch. And I think when we started on this project, our expectations were like, oh my God, this is amazing, we can finally see our story. So things that Priya was talking about a minute ago, in the sense that we can see, we have a chance to, or we have this opportunity to make sure our voices are heard, our histories that we learn at home, which we don't learn at school, which we don't learn in the textbooks, which affect us now on a day-to-day basis, can get into a mainstream museum space. Once something is in a museum, it's like it's a big tick in terms of culture. It's like a bastion, or like it's the establishment recognizing that you exist in a certain way. So we thought, oh, brilliant, we're just going to decolonize as much as we can. What we didn't realize was, as co-curators, that we're working with an institution. And it's not the individuals in that institution who are products of that institution, because you can't help it if you've been working in that space. But we're working with an institution. That institution is an establishment that was established to celebrate colonialism. So it was there as a showcase of, look at all this stuff we got from all over the world, because we own it now. And what museums don't do is, as we mentioned earlier, talk about the bloodshed and the pillage and the pain that was caused throughout that. So we thought we have an opportunity to tell the other side of the story. We have an opportunity to tell what we think, or what we feel, what we know, what we experience is the story, because our stories would be really different. There were loads and loads of challenges, and there were loads and loads of obstacles and difficulties. But I think when you see what we came up with, I think it was worth it. But we'll carry on.
So we're running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to speed through some of this. Basically, we did co-curation, and the reason why this image is up is that there's a middle image there. As you heard earlier, I referred to the Museum Detox Network of Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic workers. The reason that exists is because Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic workers are very underrepresented in their numbers in museum sector. And so one of the other elements of this project was that all 6 of the co-curators are non-white women, but also I am. And also, we recruited a researcher, Rachel Minot on the project, who's also from a non-white background. She's a British Jamaican woman, and also Birmingham Museum has got the most culturally diverse museum workforce in the country. That makes it very different than most of the museums I've worked in. But in the middle picture, you can't see it at all, so it's not that useful. But basically, sometimes I would think, oh, it's really, like, this is going to really make a difference, because it means that there's a lot of key decision makers in the project who are not white, also working with non-white people, and that's really different than typical projects whereby most of the staff are white, and often the community participants who are volunteers and their power relations are very different, are the non-white people. And so, but nevertheless, as Shaheen says, once you get all the graphic designers in the room as well, and some of your other colleagues who are not on the core project, actually, what you forget is suddenly you've got about 14 white people in the room, and if 2 of the co-curators don't turn up to the meeting that day, suddenly you're back to square one. And actually, you put 3 or 4 co-curators in a room at a massive meeting of 15 people, talking about empire, talking about quite painful issues, when they're massively outnumbered. And even I couldn't see that at the time in the meeting as a project manager, and that's just a little example of how these things come about. You're going to have to slip through this. You're just going to have to go to the exhibition. These are some of the stories that ended up in the exhibition. The colour hasn't really come out here. I think we're just going to have to somehow send you this slide later because there isn't time to go to the detail of it. But I've nicked this slide from Rebecca Bridgman's presentation at the Museum ID conference, because it really basically is the difference between what we started out with and what we ended up with, was that we took their themes and have workshopped them, what points they wanted to make about each of the different stories that they've chosen. And then we said, okay, now we're the workers, we'll go and write up the text, and we'll just send it to you. And then you just have a quick look for typos, and we send it on to the graphic designers, who are costing us an arm and a leg, and we've got to crack on and meet the production schedule. So on a Monday morning, we got probably one of the most chilling emails I've had in my career, which was like, yeah, thanks, this is all wrong. We've all taken the day off work, we're going to rewrite it, we'll send it to you at 6 PM. And at that point, we were already slightly behind with the graphic designers. So
but we did it anyway.
They did it anyway. And at the end of the day, they sent entirely new text. I don't know how they did it in one day, but they did it. And they basically kind of wrestled control over the text back to themselves. And then we said, okay, this was not the plan. This is not how we planned this. But everything changed, and there was lots of flexibility, and it meant that we ended up with a very different tone in the end, to cut a long story short. We had to check it all with academics. It was very fraught, it was very stressful for all of us on all sides. But it meant that now that the exhibition is ready, beautiful, beautiful exhibition, see, we get responses like this. Wait to see the past is now. It's the people of colour-centred anti-capitalist history of empire I've been waiting years to see in a British museum. 70 likes. On a bad day, I look at that 10 times a day. Because people are loving this exhibition. And it really, it was hard to do, but it wasn't that hard to do. We basically kind of looked at Brooklyn Museum Art Gallery, worked with brilliant people, tried really hard, copied the good things that Brooklyn Museum Art Gallery have done, which is basically don't talk to the audiences as if they're all white, it's not rocket science, and be honest about the past, and really kind of, a lot of, I think, black Asian minority people in this country just want a reckoning with the past. And not only black and Asian minority ethnic people want that, a lot of people want that. And Birmingham is the kind of city which is confident enough and ready to do that reckoning. And I think we've done a groundbreaking job in Birmingham, because the response of people to that gallery is that they say, I've been waiting my whole life to see something like this in a British museum. Why have I had to wait so long to see this? And I'd say it's the best model of decolonial practice around in the museum sector today. So I urge you all to come and add your scribbles to this, and add your voice to the conversation, and look online for #ThePastIsNow, and come on the 8th of December to our celebration event in the evening.
So just to you go back to the slides really quickly, the two panels.
This one.
1 minute. Okay, I've got 1 minute. Right, so this one that Sarah mentioned earlier was especially kind of fraught, but they sent us the interpretations, we hated them, we rewrote them, we sent them back. The versions we got back again, we still kind of hated them, but what that back and forth did, personally, the push and pull on that, whilst it might have been, it was stressful and it was quite painful, if you look at the interpretations that are actually up in the gallery now, without that back and forth, we wouldn't have had the nuance that we do have, and you wouldn't have the richness that we've got now. And so whilst it was, this ping-ponging, push and pull, and we were challenging them, and then, we'd get something back that we didn't like, I think it kind of, we've learnt a lot in the sense of what it's like to actually work with an institution. Can an establishment be decolonised? Is it even possible? But on the other hand, what you'll see when you come and visit, because now you all have to come and see the exhibition, is something that, even though for us it's not radical enough, and it may not be as drastic a change as we would have liked to see, for a museum, a museum in this country, it's actually really, really different. And if you, like Sarah said, if you search the hashtag and you'll see the reactions that people, how people are reacting to it, that in itself has kind of made this crazy process all worth it. And it's made it worth it in the sense that I think we've all learned how the system works, and the system has learned, I hope, how we work.
Learning.
Getting there.
Yeah.
Are we done?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That was almost a performance of the thought process, of the back and forth, and the need to wrestle, and the need to fight for the space over the text, over what's there, and yes, part 2 is going to be on 8th of December. Is that right, Sarah?
Sorry?
8th of December, did you say?
6 to 9 p.m.
6 to 9 p.m, so everyone be there. But now we have a bit more time for discussion and for questions. But don't worry, we're not going to keep you away from the party. You will catch the next phase of the drummers when we finish in here. So, yes.
Museums and the culture sector in general, impact upon this work that you're doing to decolonise museums.
Anyone else? One over here. Do you need a mic?
No, I'll just start. It's okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering if this is a question to everyone, if you worked on in your research anything to do with literature and the decolonisation of literature and post-colonial literature, and if so, what texts did you study and what did you find out about them?
Yeah, we'll just take one more question, then we'll have a response.
There isn't another one.
There's no good. Let's just get to the party. So.
I'll touch on some of those. The question about austerity is really interesting, actually, because as the public sector is being shrunk and pinched, actually, quite in a way, it's kind of an opportunity for dismantling some of the power structures, because we haven't got that much power. Actually, we haven't got that much resources in some ways, and actually, some of the collaborators that we work with beyond the museum have often got kind of more resources, are more equipped. And they bring, like, so for instance, you go to look at the Knights of the Raj exhibition at the moment at the Birmingham Museum Art Gallery. It's a beautiful exhibition put together by a visual artist, effectively an independent curator, a pair of independent curators. And the reach and scope and like marketing kind of muscle that they've got for that exhibition, the museum desperately needs. And our own kind of team and infrastructure and resources are kind of really stretched because of austerity and all the cuts that the museum has been subjected to, some of the worst cuts for any museum service in the country. So actually, it really changes some of the kind of power structures, and what a lot of external partners find is like, that museum is skint. Like, they start working and you see like the big building, they're like posh art and everything. You think, oh, the museum's loaded, and you've got all the resources, you're hanging on to everything, you've got all the power. They kind of get close and they smell us and they're like, God, look at the state of their offices, man. Look how these people dress. They've got power. They're not loaded. Like, you know, and so actually the sort of balance of power is changing. Very quickly about the Irish, I think that's an excellent point, and actually as people are coming into the museum, the lab, the kind of gallery that we developed, it's a prototyping gallery to inform the kind of permanent gallery that will be developed in the future. And some of the responses that we're getting from audiences are, what about the impact of empire on white working class white working class people back in Blighty when all of this was happening? And what about the other areas of colonisation? Can't you make links between common ground? Very briefly about literature, I'm just going to come in there because literature was my thing. I used to teach at SOAS. Black Skins, White Masks was the big book for me, and there was a kind of heritage conference many years ago. Stuart Hall, Birmingham-based academic, kind of said this phrase that's always stayed in my mind, which is when you're working with institutions, you have to think, are they in your mouth or are you in theirs? And that's pretty much my mantra for all of this type of work. I think that's enough from me.
Does anyone else want to?
Can I just jump in on the literature thing? So there's someone who's been doing lots of research into that. Her name is Kavita Bernat. I don't know if you've heard of her. She writes for Media Diversified, and she also just did a talk for TEDx Brum, which was last month. And her research is all about literature, but decolonising literature. So and not only literature, but the publishing world and industry. So how are we as
you know, people with more melanin represented in the publishing world, and what stories are being published and why are they being published. So the same sort of questions that Priya was asking about museum spaces, Kavita asks about publishing and literature, and she's got some stuff online, so I think if you have a look at her work, it'll be really interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say, related to Kavita Barnott's work, that the Asian writer does some quite good work around the sort of decolonising literature, and they've published several anthologies that are by ethnic minority, well, predominantly women, I would say, that are around that, and I write, and I've contributed some of those, and it's been a really amazing process. And yeah, but also there's a lot of post-colonial academic writing, which I'm sure you could probably tell us, I don't know, but which I think was sort of spurred by the sort of Edward Said theory of Orientalism, which is sort of basis for a lot of post-colonial theory that's come since then, like Gayatri Spivak, and there's a number of other academics who are writing about it in really interesting ways. And a book that writes about that in the context of art history that I find really interesting is Much Maligned Monsters by Partha Mithra. He's probably India's most eminent art historian, and he basically wrote about the way in which art from the subcontinent has been sort of put forward as being monstrous or as being other, due to the way in which it was defined during colonial times. Yes, there's loads of really amazing writing.
Are there any other questions?
I'm wondering if you have a sense of where British museums are in relation to museums, say, in the Netherlands or Spain or other imperial powers, former imperial powers. Are we behind? Are we leading the way? Are we all collaborating together?
You always think we're leading the way, don't you?
I mean, it's something I thought about quite a bit recently, but I think an interesting way of comparing the way we deal with, our museums deal with the legacy of empire, is the way in which Germany deals with the legacy of the Holocaust. And in that, if we draw that comparison, Germany are miles and streets and miles ahead. I mean, you only have to go to the Holocaust Museum, the one designed by Daniel Libeskind, and the ground floor is basically a series of objects owned by people who died in concentration camps, and they have stories behind them, and it's one of the only exhibitions I've been to that's driven me to tears. So if we want to look at an example of dealing with atrocities head-on and claiming them as real and accepting them, I think that you've got to admire Germany, yeah. There are examples.
I think there's, in Germany there's an issue of they will deal with anti-Semitism, but they won't deal with racism. So, for instance, Turkish migration, which has been central, you know, pre and post-war, that's not dealt with, and you certainly won't hardly find any Turkish academic in the academy, but they will invite people from abroad to add colour to the academy as visiting fellows. So I think there are different processes, racialising processes in place in Germany and France and elsewhere, yes. And it has to be factored in terms of knowledge systems. Any other questions? Rajinda, Sanjay, and then yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was really fantastic meeting all of you. Just interested in some of the fraughtness that particularly Sarah and Shaheen talked about towards the end. Did some of that come out? Would it, just to tell, maybe illustrate it a bit more, when you said you had problems with some of the graphic designers, are we again talking in terms of brown and black and white power relationships? Or did you also have some fraught relationships with maybe black and brown characters, protagonists themselves saying, this is not my history, or this is a contested history, and how did you negotiate that? Did they also, you know, exciting work that you're doing, they also kind of see you as, you're maybe from a different class, you're the Radio 4 category now in the way that we would critique.
Oh,
the way
Dave, sir.
No, I know, but you know, was there those fraud relationships kind of coming out as well?
Sanjay?
Yeah, great panel. Just a question around kind of intersection between race and class in relation to the decolonising project more generally, particularly in the context of museums. I teach at university and I took some of my students to a museum in London. And just talking to them, there was about people 20, and half of them had never been to a museum. They're kind of aspirational working class students who got to university. So I kind of wonder, is it a kind of filter bubble thing the decolonising thing can do, or are we kind of really opening it up, or are we just opening it up to certain groups of people?
Okay, one more question here.
Yeah, mine is just like a comment. So I've recently taken the Life in the UK test. So I have to read all these books, and you know, I prepared for a long time. So I was just going to say that all the problematic issues that you mentioned here, it exists there. So I had to learn about Kipling, I had to learn about the successes of the empire, and it was a really tough process. But also, I mean, I was really impressed how Britishness was defined by the people, and you know, the stories you mentioned here are told to people who come to museums, or as you said, in schools. But also, this is the story that's told to the next citizens, or the people who want to be citizens. So if you have some time, maybe you might also want to look at that horrible book. Everybody has to study.
Yeah, there have actually been quite a lot of studies of citizenship and the ritual and how national identity is acquired and performed. But I'm not supposed to be answering it, am I? Who wants to?
Shall I? Okay, so in regards to, say, working with graphic designers, so for us it was quite fraught, simply because they're an all-white team, and when we would, and for them I guess it was just, and they were contracted for this project, so for them it was another contract, it was just another job, whereas for us, from the co-curation side especially, we had this like very personal investment in this project. It was a very emotional investment in this project, and we would say things in meetings and, you know, describe like what the visuals should look like, and then when they came back they'd be the complete opposite. And you know, we'd say that we want to show the pain of colonization, but it would come back looking like a celebration of colonization to us. And of course, you know, visuals are very subjective and so on. And you know, and even in like larger meetings, we'd be there sort of throwing around phrases like white supremacy and white fragility and so on. And I think the designers especially were just a bit like, what's going on? Like, and there was this sort of these gaps in communication that they weren't ready for, but we were just like full steam ahead. Let's do this, you know, let's do this project. So there was lots of gaps there that, lots and lots of gaps. And I think in terms of class, I think diversity looks at skin colour and tick boxes and tokenism, which is why I find it really boring. And every time I'm asked about diversity, I'll walk out the room. Don't talk to me about diversity. If you're being truly decolonial, then you're looking at, like, you're confronting history, you're being honest, but you're also being honest not just about race, you're being honest about gender, you're being honest about class, you're being honest about all these different intersections, you're being honest about intersections of people's lives and experiences. And I think that is a really difficult thing to do. And I think what's happening now is decoloniality is being treated like diversity was. So different, you know, whether it's establishments or what have you, are co-opting what decoloniality actually means. And I think that has to be very, very clear when you're working with a group of people, like, what is this? What does it actually mean? What does it actually involve? And, you know, what do we do with it, as opposed to ticking boxes and, as Sarah said earlier, brown people in the room, you know. Very quickly.
Yeah, all of that, and just to add an interesting vignette that I sort of think encapsulates some of the class issues. It was interesting when we went on as part of the, while we were developing the project, it happened that there was a big conference happening in Rotterdam that a lot of the network, the black workers I was talking about, black museum workers, we went together, 20 of us, to this conference in that called Museum Next. And as part of the 20 of us, Shaheen and Sarah, two of the co-curators, came with us, and I was super excited about this because I think this is super radical. I've never seen like black participants who are non-museum staff be introduced to a network of solidarity of black workers within the museum sector, because I know there isn't another network because we're it, and then collectively kind of understand what that, you know, that something's going to come out of that solidarity. It's really interesting. And one of the moments that really stayed with me was that we were in a workshop together called, was it Decolonising Practice or something? It was literally like a workshop of how to decolonise museums. 70% white European workers, but like a lot of us museum detox, and Shaheen and Sarah. And we were doing this white privilege test. It was just like a little tick box test, like what's your level of privilege? And Sarah and, I don't, you won't mind me sharing the results? No. Yeah, so Sarah and Shaheen were doing that test. We were all just sitting next to each other, and I was feeling all smug and glowy in my black solidarity, and like all the black workers, and we're all together. And then we looked at our different test results, and Shaheen had 5, and no, you had 8, and Sarah had 10, and I had 5. A very different result. So basically, I had a lot more privilege, in short. Like, I was a Radio 4 person in the picture, and I was like, yeah. Yes, okay. I mean, I could have worked that out without the little test. I think we all could have worked that out. But it was interesting that we literally had like a quiz and we were looking at it, and there's not that, you know, just for the fact of that moment to have happened and to surface that difference is actually in itself, it doesn't sound like a big step maybe, but for what normally goes on in co-curation practices between participants who are non-staff and staff, to get to that point when you're looking at intersectionality of class between race and across the kind of institutional line, and just saying like, this is a thing, okay, let's just acknowledge it, was quite powerful. It was just a kind of, really explicit. And I think that, and I hope that goes some way to answering that question.
Can I? I was just going to say I was hoping Sarah was going to tell that story. So
maybe I've rolled it out before.
I mean, you may comment. So it was really, really interesting. But I thought the point was a really important one, which is that we might be sort of implicitly talking about diversifying museum narratives, and we're talking about decolonialization particularly. We've used many different terms today for that. But there are problems in terms of reaching other audiences as well. And you mentioned class, and in terms of numbers, museums find it much harder to reach people of more deprived socioeconomic background than they do people of diverse ethnic backgrounds when you look at the audience numbers. So it is really important. And the other audiences that find hard to reach are people like over the age of 60, I believe, and also young people. So this isn't the only problem, but this is a problem we're here to talk about today. So just to put it in a sort of broader context.
On the issue of, you know, the question that you asked, I think it's a really important question. And part of it, as far as I'm concerned, goes back to who are the museums programming for. So we've got to consider, you know, if you come from a deprived background, Rubiliad tells us about, you know, new migrant communities. First, it's a struggle for existence, you know, eking out your daily living is a challenge in itself. And then, are you going to go to visit a museum that doesn't even tell your story, that doesn't even link back to who you are? So when you combine, you know, ethnicity and race with the other intersectional identities of an individual's life, it becomes really, really problematic. And when you ladies were talking, I was thinking about another story told to me by my colleague who used to, for a very long time, work in Blackburn Cathedral. She was the first Muslim, I believe, to have ever been employed in an Anglican institution. And she said she and her colleagues were running this exhibition in the crypt of the cathedral on the Holocaust. And she knew that lots of, you know, all the Jews in Blackburn would come. Many of the Christians in Blackburn, because they conformed to the Radio 4 sort of stereotype, would come, but none of the Muslims were going to come, and probably none of the Muslim young people. So she spent a lot of time thinking about how could she make this exhibition interesting to them. And she did a lot of reading and went off to Jerusalem and did a lot of search there, and then found this story of you know, Turkish migrants who used to hide, you know, Jewish individuals who were trying to escape the Nazis hide them in their basements, transport them. And she said, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to include. And that went viral, and young Muslim lads who were never going to came to the exhibition and bought their friends for them. Suddenly, despite their deprivation, their caste differences, whatever, their story was being told and they'd make the effort.
Sorry, I have something which is not related actually. It's just to point out that we have perhaps the UK's only all-female dhol band, which is performing tonight. And I had a slide, but it seems to have jumped back to the first slide, so I needed to...
It's just because it's the lights on it.
No, it's the wrong slide. I have to show one slide just to point out that actually women were the first sort of visual clues to the tabla in South Asia have been of women playing it. Yeah, we have to go to the very last slide, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry, I don't know how that happened. But I had to point it out because the image I have here, and it may be very hard to see it, yes, that's the one. And I believe Nirmal is hiding the Pakhavach player. I'm so sorry, it's so weird. Maybe what I point it out now, and when we leave, when we get off the stage, you can see it. And this is an illustration from something which has nothing to do with female performers. But you have an image of these women instrumentalists, and the Pakhavach is a really old-fashioned drum, which is used for Indian classical music for Drupal. And you have women playing it here, and so when you go out and see them, this is a long history of how women were sort of removed from performing. So sorry to sort of hijack.
I think that's a perfect entry into the party. So thank you to all the panelists and for everyone turning up on a Friday night to have a discussion. Thank you.